Hey guys, tonight we begin with a surprisingly quiet question. What did medieval monks actually do all day? So dim the lights, get comfortable, and drift with me into a world where alarms did not exist, but people still managed to wake up at what feels like an entirely unreasonable hour. For many monks, the day began long before sunrise. While most of the medieval world was asleep, wrapped in blankets and avoiding responsibility, the monks were already heading toward the church for prayers. Of course they were. A monastery was designed around routine, not excitement, not adventure, definitely not sleeping in. The bell rang and everyone moved, slowly, calmly, and often while wishing they were still in bed, though they would never have admitted it. The first prayers arrived in darkness. Candles flickered, voices echoed through stone halls, and so began another carefully scheduled day in
If
medieval
one
monastic
object
life.
truly governed a medieval monastery, it was not a crown, a sword, or even the abbot's chair. It was the bell. The bell decided when the monks woke, when they prayed, when they worked, when they ate, and when they rested. There was no need to check a watch. There were, of course, no watches to check. The bell handled the entire schedule with remarkable confidence. Its sound echoed across gardens, workshops, kitchens, and quiet cloisters. Wherever a monk happened to be, the message was the same. Finish what you are doing. It is time for the next part of the day. To modern ears, such a carefully timed life might sound exhausting. Yet many monks found comfort in its steady rhythm. There were very few decisions to make. The routine carried them gently from one hour to the next, like a slow-moving river that never seemed in any particular hurry to reach the sea. Part 13. The bell that ruled everything. If one object truly governed a medieval monastery, it was not a crown, a sword, or even the abbot's chair. It was the bell. The bell decided when the monks woke, when they prayed, when they worked, when they ate, and when they rested. There was no need to check a watch. There were, of course, no watches to check. The bell handled the entire schedule with remarkable confidence. Its sound echoed across gardens, workshops, kitchens, and quiet cloisters. Wherever a monk happened to be, the message was the same. Finish what you are doing. It is time for the next part of the day. To modern ears, such a carefully timed life might sound exhausting. Yet many monks found comfort in its steady rhythm. There were very few decisions to make. The routine carried them gently from one hour to the next, like a slow-moving river that never seemed in any
Early
particular hurry
prayers,
to reach
the
the sea.
monks did not immediately rush toward a grand breakfast. Medieval monasteries were many things, but luxury resorts were not among them. Meals were usually simple. Bread appeared often, porridge appeared often. Sometimes vegetables joined the gathering. The average monk was not waking up to stacks of pancakes and a cheerful cup of flavored coffee. History can be disappointing like that. Silence was also common during meals. In some monasteries, one monk would read religious texts aloud while everyone else ate. Imagine sitting through breakfast while listening to a serious lecture every single day. Some monks probably found it inspiring. Others may have spent several minutes thinking about bread. Once the meal ended, work began, and there was always work. A monastery functioned like a small community, requiring gardens, kitchens, workshops, and endless maintenance. Let's gently float toward the jobs people have of medieval monks involves sitting quietly with a giant book all day. And while some certainly did that, most monks had far less glamorous responsibilities. After breakfast, the monastery came alive with work. Some monks headed into the gardens, others cared for animals. A few repaired buildings that seemed determined to fall apart every winter. Medieval stone walls looked impressive, but they had a habit of needing attention. The most famous monks were the scribes. These were the patient souls who copied books by hand, letter by letter. One small mistake could mean starting over or carefully scraping ink from the page. Not exactly a stress-free hobby. Hours passed in a rhythm of labor and prayer. Bells interrupted the day at regular intervals, calling everyone back together. The schedule was so predictable that a modern office worker might actually recognize it. Only with fewer meetings and considerably more scriptorium, the morning could feel very long indeed. This was the room where books were copied by hand, and every page demanded an almost heroic level of patience. A scribe sat at a desk with ink, parchment, and a text to copy. Then he wrote, slowly, carefully, very carefully. One distracted moment could turn a perfectly respectable sentence into a small disaster. The work required concentration for hours at a time. There were no keyboards, no spell checkers, and certainly no convenient button labeled undo. Medieval monks would probably have considered such a thing a miracle. Meanwhile, sunlight crept through narrow windows, and dust drifted lazily through the air. The room remained quiet, except for the scratching of pens across parchment. It was not exciting work. That was precisely the point. Monastic life valued discipline, patience, and routine. And routine, as we are discovering into his work, the bells would ring again. This happened throughout the day. The monastery schedule revolved around prayer, and everyone was expected to stop what they were doing and return to the church. So the scribe put down his pen. The gardener left his vegetables. The cook stepped away from whatever medieval recipe was quietly bubbling away. Then the community gathered once more. The prayers themselves followed familiar patterns. Psalms were sung, passages were read, voices rose and fell through the stone building with a calm, steady rhythm. It was a routine repeated day after day, year after year. For modern people, the constant interruptions might seem inconvenient. For monks, they were the structure holding the entire day together. When the service ended, everyone returned to work. There were still gardens to tend, books to copy, floors to sweep, and countless small tasks waiting patiently. Medieval life, it turns out, was surprisingly busy for people. Spent his days surrounded by books. Many spent hours outdoors tending gardens that helped keep the monastery fed throughout the year. These gardens were serious business. Vegetables, herbs, and fruit all needed attention. A neglected garden could mean a difficult winter, which was something nobody was eager to experience. Medieval monks may have been devoted to spiritual matters, but they also appreciated having enough food. The herb gardens were especially important. Monasteries often maintained collections of medicinal plants used to treat common illnesses. In a world with limited medical knowledge, a monk with a useful herb could seem surprisingly valuable. Meanwhile, other brothers cared for livestock, repaired fences, or hauled supplies around the grounds. It was not glamorous work. Then again, glamour was not listed among the monastic virtues. As the morning slowly drifted toward midday, stomachs began reminding everyone that breakfast had happened quite a long time. The monastery had already been awake for many hours. Work had been completed, prayers had been offered, and countless small duties had quietly filled the morning. The bell rang once again, and the monks made their way toward the dining hall. Just like breakfast, lunch was usually simple. A generous feast was not the goal. The purpose was nourishment, not culinary adventure. Bread remained a loyal companion at the table. Vegetables appeared frequently. Fish was common on many days, especially because religious rules often limited the consumption of meat. Medieval monks spent a surprising amount of time finding creative ways to eat anything that was not technically forbidden. Silence often continued during meals. While everyone ate, a designated reader stood nearby and read from religious works or the lives of saints. Imagine trying to focus on your lunch while listening to a detailed account of a saint's virtues. Some monks found it uplifting.
Although monastery
Others
life
were
was built
probably
around
wondering.
routine, the outside world occasionally came knocking. Quite literally, travelers, pilgrims, and weary merchants often arrived at the monastery gates seeking food, shelter, or simply a safe place to rest for the night. Hospitality was considered an important duty. A guest was to be welcomed with kindness. even if he appeared just as the monks were hoping for a quiet evening. Medieval life rarely offered the luxury of checking whether visitors had made a reservation. Some monasteries became well known for caring for the poor and the sick. Others provided lodging for pilgrims on long journeys. The guest house was usually separate from the monks' private living quarters, allowing the community to maintain its peaceful routine while still offering help. Once the visitors had been settled, the familiar rhythm returned. Another bell echoed across the courtyard, calling everyone back to prayer. The day was slowly drawing toward evening, just as it had the day before, and just as it almost certainly behind the monastery walls. The pace of the day became even gentler. Long shadows stretched across the cloister, and the sounds of work slowly faded away. Buckets were put aside. Pens were cleaned. Garden tools returned to their familiar places, ready for another remarkably similar tomorrow. The monks gathered once more for evening prayers. Their voices drifted through the cool stone halls, steady and unhurried. It was a sound many of them had heard thousands of times, yet it remained the quiet heartbeat of monastic life. Afterward came a modest evening meal, if the monastery's customs allowed one. Conversation was still limited, and silence remained an old companion. For people living in our wonderfully noisy world, the calm might seem almost impossible. For the monks, it simply felt normal. As darkness settled over the monastery, the day was not quite finished. There was still one final office to attend before sleep could finally claim the community. Night settled right on the monastery. As always. The final service of the day quietly approached. The monks gathered for Compline, the last set of prayers before bed. The candles burned softly, casting warm light across old stone walls that had witnessed this same routine for generations. The words were familiar. The melodies were gentle. After an entire day shaped by bells, work, and worship, Compline marked the peaceful close of another ordinary day. There was something comforting about its predictability. No dramatic speeches, no last-minute surprises, just a calm ending. When the prayers were finished, the monastery entered what was known as the Grand Silence. From that moment until morning, unnecessary conversation simply stopped. Imagine an entire building where hundreds of people quietly agreed not to chat about the weather, the garden, or whose bread had turned out slightly better. Social media would have found it a very challenging environment. One by one, the monks returned to their simple cells. Tomorrow's bell would arrive long before sunrise, and the familiar rhythm would begin all over again. He was not stepping into a place of comfort or luxury. The room was usually small, plain, and furnished with only the essentials. A simple bed, a stool, perhaps a shelf for a few treasured books. That was often enough. The purpose of the cell was not to impress visitors. In fact, there were very few visitors. It was a quiet space for rest, prayer, and reflection. Decorative furniture would have seemed rather unnecessary, and perhaps a little suspiciously extravagant. The bed itself was modest by modern standards. Thick mattresses and fluffy pillows were not exactly part of the medieval monastic experience. After a day of walking, working, praying, and standing through long services, however, almost any bed probably felt perfectly acceptable. Outside, the monastery grew still. Only the occasional breeze or distant owl disturbed the silence. Before many hours had passed, the familiar bell would ring again, gently pulling another ordinary day into motion. You might wonder exactly whether medieval monks ever had a few quiet moments to themselves. The answer is yes, although free time looked rather different from what we imagine today. A monk was unlikely to spend the afternoon inventing new hobbies or wondering what to stream next. Instead, quieter moments were often devoted to private prayer, reading, or peaceful reflection. Even a slow walk through the cloister could become part of the day's spiritual rhythm. Some monks enjoyed studying the natural world. They observed birds in the monastery gardens, tended fruit trees, or carefully examined herbs growing along stone paths. Curiosity was not forbidden, provided it pointed the mind toward learning rather than distraction. Of course, not every monk was perfectly focused every minute of the day. Minds wandered then just as they do now. During a long reading or an especially familiar prayer, someone was almost certainly thinking about tomorrow's chores, or perhaps hoping the bread at the next meal would be just a little fresher. Even in the Middle Ages, ordinary human thoughts had a way to winter. Life inside the monastery changed in subtle ways. The rhythm remained the same, but the world beyond the walls became colder, darker, and far less inviting. The stone buildings were beautiful, but they were not especially good at keeping out the cold. A monk might spend hours copying a manuscript while his fingers slowly forgot what warmth felt like. Ink thickened in the chill, and candles became faithful companions through the long afternoons. The gardens rested beneath frost, so outdoor work became less demanding. Instead, more attention shifted indoors. Books were repaired, clothing was mended, and tools were carefully maintained for the coming spring. There always seemed to be another small task waiting patiently. Evening arrived surprisingly early. The bells sounded through crisp winter air, and the monastery settled once again into prayer and silence. Outside, snow or cold rain might cover the fields. Inside, the familiar routine continued almost unchanged, quietly reminding the monks that every season, no matter how harsh, needed someone to guide the community, and that responsibility usually belonged to the abbot. He was not a king, although from a distance his daily schedule may have looked almost as busy. The difference was that his kingdom consisted of gardens, workshops, manuscripts, and a remarkable number of people who all needed direction. The abbot was expected to lead by example. He supervised the monastery, settled disagreements, welcomed important visitors, and tried to ensure that both the spiritual life and the practical work stayed in balance. It was less about giving dramatic speeches and more about making hundreds of quiet decisions. Of course, not every abbot was equally gifted. Some were remembered for wisdom and patience. Others earned a reputation for being rather strict. Medieval records, like modern office gossip, occasionally hint that certain leaders were easier to live with than others. Still, when the monastery bell rang, even the abbot followed the same rhythm. In the end, everyone inside a monastery, reading held a special place. Books were rare, expensive, and often copied by hand, so every volume was treated with enormous care. A single manuscript could represent months, or even years, of patient work. Many monks spent part of each day engaged in what was called sacred reading. This was not speed reading. Nobody was trying to finish 3 books before lunch. Instead, they read slowly, thoughtfully, sometimes returning to the same passage again and again. To modern readers, this might sound surprisingly familiar. After all, many people have opened a page, read a paragraph, and immediately realized their mind had wandered somewhere else entirely. Medieval monks were human too. Some monasteries built impressive libraries filled with religious texts, histories, and works from the ancient world. Without the efforts of countless patient scribes and readers, many important writings might have disappeared forever. It was quiet work, slow work, and, in its own way, some of the most important work happening anywhere. The monastery settled back into its familiar rhythm. There was no dramatic change of pace, no surprise visitors arriving with urgent quests, no mysterious maps leading to hidden treasure. Medieval monks would likely have considered such things extremely inconvenient. Instead, the afternoon brought more work. The scribes returned to their manuscripts. Gardeners checked their crops. Craftsmen repaired tools, furniture, and anything else that had decided to stop cooperating. In a large monastery, there was always something that needed fixing. Some monks spent time teaching younger members of the community. Reading, writing, and religious instruction were important parts of monastic life. Knowledge was treated as something valuable, worth preserving and passing along. The hours moved slowly, marked by bells and prayers. To modern ears, the schedule may sound repetitive. And it was. That repetition was intentional. Monks believed that a steady routine helped focus the mind and avoid unnecessary distractions. As the sun drifted lower in the sky, another prayer service approached, arriving right on schedule. A monastery involved prayer, books, or deep philosophical reflection. Someone also had to deal with the less glamorous realities of daily life. Clothes needed washing, floors needed sweeping, kitchens needed cleaning. History, unfortunately, contains a great deal more housekeeping than most documentaries admit. Monastic clothing was usually simple and practical. The famous robes did not magically remain clean through prayer alone. They collected dirt, dust, and the occasional mysterious stain just like any other garment. Laundry was hard work. Water had to be carried, heated when possible, and used carefully. A task that takes minutes today could consume a significant part of the day in the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, the monastery kitchens remained busy. Pots were scrubbed, bread was baked, and supplies were organized. Behind every peaceful prayer service stood a small army of people making sure dinner actually existed. It may not sound heroic, but monasteries depended on these ordinary chores. Even the most spiritual communities still needed clean clothes and reasonably prayers and careful schedules. Monks were not immune to illness. A medieval monastery could be a peaceful place, but it was still part of a world where even a minor sickness sometimes became a serious problem. Many larger monasteries maintained an infirmary, a quiet area where sick monks could rest and recover. The care available was limited by medieval knowledge, but the effort was genuine. Herbal remedies were prepared, beds were arranged, and fellow monks offered assistance where they could. Some monasteries became surprisingly skilled at basic medical care. They cultivated medicinal herbs and copied medical texts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. A monk who knew the difference between helpful herbs and completely useless ones could become a very valuable person indeed. When illness spread through the community, the familiar rhythm of monastery life slowed. Duties were shared, schedules adjusted, and prayers offered for recovery. Yet even during difficult times, the bells continued to ring. The routine endured, providing a sense of order in a world that seemed determined to appear at nearly every meal. It was bread. Medieval monks encountered bread with such regularity that they probably stopped noticing it after a while. It was simply there, as dependable as the monastery bell. The kitchen was one of the busiest places in the entire complex. Long before a meal appeared on the table, someone had been grinding grain, kneading dough, tending fires, and preparing ingredients. Feeding a large community every day required careful planning. Depending on the monastery and the season, meals might include vegetables, beans, fish, cheese, or fruit. The menu was rarely extravagant. Still, many monasteries managed to produce food that was nourishing and surprisingly varied. Of course, there were fasting days as well. Quite a few of them, in fact. Medieval monks spent a remarkable amount of time navigating rules about what could and could not be eaten. Human creativity, it turns out, becomes very impressive when lunch is involved. As evening approached, the kitchen fires continued to glow, quietly supporting the rhythm. Most of life unfolded within the monastery grounds. Yet the outside world was never completely absent. News, travelers, merchants, and pilgrims regularly passed through, carrying stories from distant towns and faraway kingdoms. Imagine spending months focused on prayer, gardening, and copying manuscripts, only to hear that a king had started another dispute with a neighboring ruler. Medieval monarchs had a remarkable talent for creating fresh complications. Some things, it seems, never change. Visitors often brought news of harvests, wars, weather, and political events. A monastery could become an unexpected center of information, where stories arrived from many directions before continuing on their journey. Still, most monks remained observers rather than participants. Their duty was not to chase every new event, but to maintain the steady rhythm of their community. And so, after hearing the latest tales from the outside world, the monks usually returned to familiar tasks. The garden still needed attention. The books still needed copying. And the bell, naturally, still expected everyone to be exactly where they were filled the world with books. Monasteries served as some of Europe's most important centers of writing. If you wanted a copy of a text, someone had to sit down and create it by hand. Slowly, very slowly. Inside the scriptorium, scribes spent countless hours copying manuscripts line by line. Their desks held parchment, ink, and a level of patience that most modern people would consider almost supernatural. The work demanded accuracy. A skipped word or misplaced line could create confusion for future readers. Not that every monk was perfect. Medieval manuscripts occasionally contain little mistakes, doodles, and even complaints about tired hands. After several hours of copying tiny letters, one can understand the sentiment. Some books were decorated with beautiful illustrations and elaborate initials. These illuminated manuscripts required additional artists who carefully painted colors and intricate designs onto the page. The result was something extraordinary. Each finished manuscript represented months of labor, concentration, and dedication. While kings built castles and fought wars, monks quietly preserved knowledge, one careful line at a time. Beneath the steady glow of candlelight, monks often passed through one of the most peaceful places in the monastery, the cloister. This was a covered walkway surrounding a quiet courtyard, usually filled with grass, herbs, or a simple garden. At first glance, it might seem like an ordinary passageway, but the cloister was much more than that. It connected the church, dining hall, dormitory, and other important buildings. In many ways, it was the monastery's calm and steady center. A monk walking through the cloister was encouraged to do so quietly. The space invited reflection rather than conversation. Footsteps echoed softly beneath stone arches while sunlight drifted across the courtyard. Of course, even the most disciplined monk occasionally found his thoughts wandering. Perhaps he thought about a manuscript he was copying. Perhaps he wondered whether tomorrow's weather would cooperate with the gardening schedule. Human minds have always been wonderfully unpredictable. Yet the cloister had a way of slowing everything down. It reminded the monks to move gently, think carefully, and follow the familiar things about medieval monasteries is how carefully they organized time without having the clocks we rely on today. There were no smartphones, no wristwatches, and certainly no notifications reminding someone that a meeting was about to begin. Instead, monks paid close attention to the natural world. The position of the sun, the length of shadows, and the ringing of bells helped structure the day. In some monasteries, specially trained monks were responsible for tracking the hours as accurately as possible. It was an important job. If the timing slipped, the entire routine could become slightly confused. Nighttime brought its own challenges. Determining the correct hour in darkness was not always easy. Yet monasteries developed methods to keep their schedules remarkably consistent. The result was a community that lived according to a rhythm rather than a precise minute-by-minute timetable. Life flowed from prayer to work, from work to meals, and from meals back to prayer. In a strange way, the monks were always aware of time, even while moving through it at an exceptionally at the monastery as a wise old scholar with a perfectly copied manuscript tucked under his arm. Every experienced monk had once been a beginner, and those beginners were known as novices. A novice entered a world filled with rules, routines, and more bells than he had probably encountered in his entire previous life. The transition could be challenging. Monastic life demanded discipline, patience, and a willingness to follow a schedule that rarely changed. Older monks guided the newcomers through daily prayers, readings, and practical duties. They learned when to speak, when to remain silent, and how to participate in the rhythm of the community. Some novices discovered that monastery life suited them perfectly. Others found the endless routine more difficult than expected. Rising before dawn sounds admirable in theory. It becomes considerably less romantic when it happens every day. Still, year by year, new generations joined the community. They learned the customs, absorbed the traditions, and gradually became the experienced monks responsible for teaching those who would follow after them. And so the cycle continued, quietly repeating itself. Features of monastic life was the amount of silence. Modern life is filled with conversations, messages, notifications, and a seemingly endless stream of opinions. A medieval monastery offered something very different. Many monastic communities placed great value on quiet. This did not mean the monks never spoke. That would have made daily life rather complicated. Imagine trying to run a kitchen entirely through dramatic eyebrow movements. Instead, conversation was limited to what was necessary. During certain hours, especially at night, silence was expected. The goal was to reduce distractions and encourage reflection. Some monasteries even developed simple hand signals for common requests. A monk could communicate basic needs without interrupting the peaceful atmosphere. It was not a complete language, but it helped keep unnecessary chatter to a minimum. Of course, complete silence is surprisingly difficult for human beings. People have always enjoyed sharing thoughts and stories. Yet generation after generation of monks practiced the discipline of quiet living. And as the sounds of the outside world faded, the monastery settled once more into its familiar calm, guided by bells, routine, discipline, and the steady passage of time. Monks were not expected to live every single day in exactly the same way. Scattered throughout the year were feast days, special occasions that brought a welcome change to the usual rhythm. These celebrations marked important religious events and honored saints whose stories were remembered throughout the Christian world. The monastery still followed its schedule, but the atmosphere often felt lighter. Meals might be a little better than usual. Extra food could appear on the tables. After weeks of familiar bread and vegetables, even a modest improvement probably felt quite exciting. Medieval excitement, admittedly, operated on a different scale than ours. The church itself might be decorated more elaborately. Additional prayers and ceremonies filled the day, and visitors sometimes joined the celebrations. For younger monks and novices, feast days provided a break from the ordinary routine. Not a wild break, of course. Nobody was organizing medieval dance competitions in the cloister. The celebrations remained orderly and respectful. Still, these special days reminded the community that life was not only about discipline and work. There was also room for gratitude, remembrance, and the occasional organized communities, but they shared one problem with everyone else in the Middle Ages. They had absolutely no control over the weather. A long period of rain could turn pathways into mud and make outdoor work far more difficult. Gardens became waterlogged, supplies were harder to transport, and even a simple trip across the monastery grounds could become an exercise in patience. Then there were droughts. A lack of rain threatened crops and reduced harvests. For communities that depended heavily on their own fields and gardens, this was a serious concern. No amount of careful planning could persuade the clouds to be more cooperative. Winter brought its own challenges. Snow-blocked roads, ice-covered paths, cold winds slipped through cracks in stone walls with impressive determination. Yet the routine continued. Bells still rang. Prayers were still said. Meals were still prepared. In many ways, the monastery's greatest strength was its consistency. The seasons changed. The weather shifted. Storms came and went. Through it all, the community carried on, one ordinary day after another, moving at the same calm within a monastery. Few were valued more highly than the library. To a modern visitor, the shelves might have seemed surprisingly small. To a medieval monk, however, they represented a treasure greater than many chests of gold. Books were rare. Every volume required parchment, ink, skill, and an enormous amount of time. A single manuscript might take months to produce and even longer to decorate. Naturally, monasteries protected their collections with great care. The library was not a noisy place. Then again, very little in a monastery was. Monks entered to study, read, and consult texts that connected them with centuries of knowledge. Some books contained religious teachings. Others preserved history, science, philosophy, or works from the ancient world. Without these collections, many important texts might have vanished entirely. A monk opening a manuscript was doing more than reading. He was participating in a chain of knowledge stretching across generations. It was a quiet responsibility, carried out page by page. Beneath the soft glow of candlelight and the watchful silence, the monastery arrived with clear skies and cheerful birdsong. Sometimes the rain settled in for hours, or even days, tapping steadily against roofs and turning pathways into muddy obstacles. On such days, much of the community's attention shifted indoors. The scriptorium became especially active. Monks copied manuscripts, repaired worn books, and carefully organized the library. Candles flickered while rain drummed softly outside, creating a setting that was either wonderfully peaceful or slightly sleepy, quite possibly both. Elsewhere, clothing was mended, tools were repaired, and supplies were counted. Monastic life always seemed to have another practical task waiting patiently in the background. For some monks, rainy weather may even have been welcome. Gardening could pause for a while, and outdoor chores became less demanding. The monastery felt smaller, quieter, and more focused. Meanwhile, beyond the walls, roads became muddy and travel slowed to a crawl. Visitors were fewer, journeys were delayed, and the wider world seemed far away. Inside, however, the familiar rhythm continued, untouched by the weather, guided as always by prayer, work, and the steady darkness settled over the medieval world. Monasteries depended heavily on one simple invention: the candle. Without it, reading, writing, and many evening activities would have become remarkably difficult. Candles were not something that simply appeared on demand. They had to be made, stored, and used carefully. In many monasteries, this was yet another task woven into the fabric of daily life. The process required patience. Wax or tallow was melted, wicks were prepared, and layers were built up gradually. It was repetitive work, which means it fit perfectly into the monastic lifestyle we have been exploring. A good candle was valuable. It extended the working day, illuminated manuscripts, and guided monks through the dark hours before dawn prayers. A poorly made candle, meanwhile, had a tendency to smoke, drip, or surrender to gravity in embarrassing ways. So while kings held feasts and nobles discussed politics, somewhere inside a monastery, a monk was probably making candles, quietly, carefully, ensuring that tomorrow's prayers and manuscripts would not be conducted through a monastery garden. Might have noticed that not every plant was grown for food. Tucked between vegetables and fruit trees were carefully maintained patches of herbs, many of which served a very practical purpose. For medieval monks, the garden was often part pantry, part classroom, and part pharmacy. Plants such as sage, mint, rosemary, and other herbs were cultivated with great care. Some were used in cooking. Others were prepared as remedies for common ailments. A headache, an upset stomach, or a troublesome cough might all lead someone toward the herb garden rather than a modern medicine cabinet. The monks observed which plants seemed helpful and recorded their findings in manuscripts. Not every remedy worked as well as they hoped, of course. Medieval medicine occasionally wandered into some very creative territory. Still, many monasteries became respected centers of healing and practical knowledge. Their gardens reflected centuries of observation, patience, and experience. As the seasons passed, the herbs continued to grow, quietly supporting the daily life of the community. One leaf and one was not inhabited by monks alone. Depending on its size and location, a surprising number of animals also called the grounds home. Chickens scratched around farmyards, providing eggs for the community. Cows supplied milk. Sheep offered wool that could be turned into clothing and blankets. Even the most peaceful monastery needed practical resources, and animals played an important role in keeping everything running. The monks responsible for caring for livestock spent much of their day feeding animals, cleaning shelters, and checking that no creature had decided to wander somewhere inconvenient. Animals have always possessed a certain talent for ignoring human plans. Cats were especially useful residents. Libraries and storerooms attracted mice, and mice had a troubling tendency to nibble things that monks preferred to keep intact. A hard-working monastery cat could become one of the most appreciated members of the community, even if it never attended a single prayer service. As the seasons changed, the animals followed their own routines alongside the monks. Together they formed part of the small, self-sufficient world contained within the monastery walls, a world shaped by work, patience, and the steady ringing of bells. The more a monastery begins to resemble a tiny town hidden behind stone walls. It had kitchens, workshops, gardens, storage buildings, guest houses, and sometimes even its own mill. All of these pieces worked together to support the community. A monk might spend his entire day without ever leaving the grounds. Everything he needed was often close at hand. Food was grown nearby. Books were copied in the scriptorium. Repairs were handled in workshops. Visitors arrived at the gate when necessary. This self-sufficiency was important. Travel could be slow, difficult, and sometimes dangerous. The more a monastery could produce for itself, the more stable it became. Of course, keeping such a community running required constant effort. Someone had to bake the bread. Someone had to maintain the buildings. Someone had to make sure supplies did not mysteriously disappear. And so, beneath the quiet atmosphere, There was always work taking place. The monastery appeared peaceful from the outside, but it functioned through the steady labor of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people moving through their daily aim to be self-sufficient. They were not completely isolated from the wider world. In fact, many were closely connected to the local economy, even if the monks themselves preferred a quieter life. Monasteries owned land, managed farms, and sometimes operated mills where local people brought grain to be ground into flour. These activities helped support the community and provided resources for maintaining buildings, feeding guests, and caring for the poor. Markets also played a role. Surplus goods such as wool, wine, cheese, or honey might be exchanged or sold. A monastery was a spiritual center, certainly, but it was also a practical institution that needed food, tools, and supplies. The monks themselves were not usually wandering through crowded marketplaces every week. Much of this work was handled by appointed officials or lay workers connected to the monastery. Still, these economic ties meant that monasteries were woven into the fabric of medieval society. Behind the peaceful walls and quiet prayers existed a network of farms, workshops, and trade that helped keep the entire community functioning. Season after season, things medieval monks produced was not bread, wine, or even beautiful manuscripts. It was information. Across Europe, monks carefully recorded events taking place around them. They wrote about kings, battles, famines, unusual weather, eclipses, and important happenings in their regions. These records, known as chronicles, would eventually become some of our best windows into the medieval world. The work was rarely dramatic. A monk might spend part of the evening quietly noting that a local lord had died, that a harvest had been unusually good, or that heavy rains had flooded nearby fields. At the time, these observations probably seemed routine. The monk writing them could hardly have imagined that centuries later historians would eagerly study his words. Of course, monks were still human. Their accounts sometimes reflected personal opinions, local loyalties, or simple misunderstandings. Medieval chroniclers were not immune to gossip any more than modern people are. Even so, their dedication preserved countless details that might otherwise have disappeared into silence. Thanks to them, the distant past remains just a monastery that could briefly distract a monk from his thoughts. It was probably the bakery. After all, even the most disciplined spiritual life becomes a little more pleasant when fresh bread is involved. Bread formed the foundation of many meals. It appeared at breakfast, lunch, and dinner with such reliability that it might as well have been an honorary member of the monastery. The bakers worked long before most people thought about eating. Grain was milled into flour, dough was mixed, and ovens were carefully heated. Timing mattered. A loaf pulled out too early could be disappointing. A loaf left too long might become an unfortunate lesson in medieval charcoal production. The smell of baking bread drifted through nearby buildings, quietly announcing that another meal was on its way. No bells required. Like so many tasks in monastic life, baking combined skill, patience, and routine. The work was repeated day after day, year after year, producing something simple but essential. And in a world filled with uncertainty, there was comfort in knowing that, sooner or later, another loaf every monastery depended upon every single day. And it was not parchment, candles, or even bread. It was water. A reliable well was one of the most important features of a monastery. Water was needed for cooking, cleaning, gardening, washing clothes, caring for animals, and countless other daily tasks. Without it, the carefully organized rhythm of monastic life would begin to unravel surprisingly quickly. Fetching water was not a glamorous responsibility. No medieval chronicler ever wrote. And then Brother Thomas carried another bucket, and it was truly magnificent. Yet the task remained essential. Throughout the day, monks and workers carried buckets across courtyards and through passageways. The work was repetitive but necessary. Monastic life depended on many such duties. Small jobs that rarely attracted attention but quietly kept the entire community functioning. The well also served as a gathering point of sorts. Even in a place that valued silence, people inevitably crossed paths there while going about their responsibilities. And so the buckets rose and fell, day after day, supplying the monastery with the simple resource that made nearly every other time listening to monastery bells, so it seems only fair to spend a moment with the person responsible for ringing them. In many monasteries, a monk was assigned the important task of keeping track of the hours and sounding the bells at the proper times. It may not sound like a prestigious position, but the entire community depended on it. If the bell rang too early, everyone would arrive confused and slightly annoyed. If it rang too late, prayers, meals, and work schedules could drift out of order. In a world built on routine, accuracy mattered. The bell ringer often rose before everyone else. He watched the passage of time using the sun, candles, water clocks, or other methods available to the monastery. It required attention, patience, and a willingness to be awake when most people preferred not to be. Of course, even the best bell ringer was human. One imagines that somewhere in medieval Europe, a sleepy monk occasionally wondered whether anyone would notice if the morning bell arrived just a few minutes later. The answer, the monastery gate, yes, marked the boundary between two very different worlds. Inside lay routine, prayer, and familiar faces. Outside stretched the unpredictable landscape of medieval life, filled with travelers, merchants, nobles, farmers, and the occasional person who seemed determined to complicate everyone's day. The gate was more than an entrance. It was a point of connection between the monastery and the wider world. Throughout the year, visitors arrived seeking food, shelter, advice, or assistance. Pilgrims stopped to rest during long journeys. Messengers delivered letters and news. Local villagers came with questions, requests, or practical matters that required attention. The monk responsible for greeting visitors needed patience and good judgment. Not every traveler carried the same story, and not every request could be granted. Yet hospitality remained an important part of monastic life. Guests were welcomed, meals were shared, and beds were offered when possible. Then, after the visitors departed and the gate closed once more, the monastery settled back into its familiar rhythm. The outside world continued on its way, while inside the walls, another quiet evening of prayer and routine understood very well was that nothing lasted forever. Shoes wore out, tools broke, furniture loosened, roofs leaked. Even the most peaceful monastery could not escape the laws of wear and tear. That is why workshops played such an important role in daily life. Inside these practical spaces, monks and skilled workers repaired tools, maintained carts, fixed doors, and crafted items needed by the community. A broken shovel was not simply thrown away and replaced with a new one. In the Middle Ages, things were expected to be repaired, often many times. The workshop smelled of wood, leather, metal, and hard work. Hammers tapped steadily. Knives were sharpened. Handles were replaced. Small problems were addressed before they became larger ones. There is something surprisingly modern about this approach. Rather than constantly seeking something new, the monastery focused on caring for what it already had. And so, while scribes copied books and gardeners tended crops, someone in the workshop quietly kept the machinery of daily life running, not with grand inventions or dramatic breakthroughs, but with patience, skill, and a determination to make one more. The monastery dining hall, known as the refectory, might seem like one of the simpler parts of monastic life. People sat down, ate their food, and moved on with the day. Yet, as with most things in a monastery, there was a carefully ordered routine behind it all. The monks entered in an orderly manner and took their assigned places. Meals began with prayers and ended with prayers. Between those moments, silence was often observed. Instead of conversation, a reader stood at a lectern and read aloud from religious texts, histories, or the lives of saints. While everyone ate bread, vegetables, and whatever else the kitchen had prepared, they also listened. This created an atmosphere very different from a modern dinner table. There were no debates about the weather, no discussions of local gossip, and certainly no one asking to pass the salt every few minutes. The refectory was meant to nourish both body and mind. Whether every monk remained equally focused on the reading while staring at a particularly appealing loaf of bread is another question entirely. Human nature, after all, has always been wonderful about monastic life was not any single task, building, or tradition. It was the fact that the entire cycle repeated itself, day after day, with extraordinary consistency. Long before sunrise, while most of the surrounding countryside remained asleep, the monastery was already beginning to stir. Somewhere in the darkness, the bell ringer prepared for another morning. Candles flickered to life. Doors opened quietly. Sandaled footsteps echoed along familiar corridors. The monks rose from their beds and made their way toward the church. Some were young novices still adjusting to the schedule. Others had followed the same routine for decades. Yet all of them answered the bell. There is something almost timeless about this scene. The same prayers, the same stone walls, the same journey through the darkness toward the first service of the day. Outside, kingdoms changed. Rulers came and went. Entire generations passed away. Inside the monastery, however, another morning began exactly as the previous one had ended. Calmly, quietly, and with the steady rhythm that shaped every monastery followed its routines, one truth remained unchanged. Every monk, from the youngest novice to the oldest abbot, would eventually reach the end of his journey. Most monasteries contained a cemetery within or near their grounds. It was a simple place, often far less elaborate than the grand tombs of kings and nobles. Monastic life emphasized humility, and that ideal extended even into death. As monks walked past the cemetery during their daily routines, they were gently reminded of life's temporary nature. This was not meant to be frightening. Instead, it encouraged reflection and gratitude. When a member of the community died, prayers were offered, bells were rung, and the monastery gathered to remember him. Then, gradually, the familiar rhythm resumed. A new novice might eventually occupy the place once held by an older monk. Another scribe would continue copying manuscripts. Another gardener would tend the herbs. The work carried on. In this way, the monastery stretched across generations. Individual lives came and went, but the community endured, quietly moving forward beneath the same bells, the same prayers, and the same discipline and routine. A monastery contained a surprising number of small distractions. Not dramatic distractions, of course. No wandering circus was about to roll through the cloister. But everyday life has always found ways to interrupt even the most carefully organized schedule. One of the most common sources of gentle chaos was the monastery cat. Cats were welcomed for practical reasons. Libraries, kitchens, and storerooms attracted mice, and mice had an unfortunate habit of treating valuable manuscripts as a snack. A good cat helped protect both food and books. Yet cats, being cats, were unlikely to limit themselves to official duties. One can easily imagine a scribe concentrating on a manuscript while a cat decided that the most comfortable place in the entire monastery was directly on top of the page being copied. Some challenges truly are timeless. Beyond the cats were countless other small interruptions. A loose gate, a missing tool, an escaped chicken, or a visitor arriving at an inconvenient moment. Nothing particularly dramatic. Just the ordinary unpredictability of life quietly finding its way into even the calmest corners stretched across the countryside. The monastery entered one of its busiest seasons. The crops that had been planted and tended for months were finally ready for harvest. This was not work that could be postponed. Fields of grain needed to be gathered before storms arrived. Vegetables had to be collected, sorted, and stored. Fruit was preserved for the colder months ahead. Everywhere one looked, there seemed to be another task waiting patiently. The harvest was a reminder that monastic life depended on practical labor as much as prayer. A beautifully copied manuscript could preserve knowledge for centuries, but it would not provide dinner in the middle of winter. So the community worked steadily beneath the summer sun. Monks, lay workers, and helpers moved through fields and gardens, bringing in the results of an entire season's effort. There was satisfaction in the work. Every basket filled, every sack stored, and every cart unloaded represented security for the months ahead. And as evening bells echoed across the fields, the monastery could look upon its harvest and know that another year of preparation was slowly, quietly over the monastery once again. A different kind of quiet filled the air. The busy sounds of the day faded away. Workshops closed. Gardens rested. The kitchen fires burned lower, and long shadows stretched across the courtyard. Night transformed the monastery. The familiar buildings looked different beneath the glow of candles and moonlight. Stone walls that seemed ordinary during the day took on a softer, calmer appearance. The cloister grew still. Footsteps became rare. Most of the community had already withdrawn into silence. A few monks might still be reading by candlelight or completing a final task before bed. But activity slowed considerably. Outside the walls, the medieval world continued its restless movement. Travelers followed dark roads. Farmers settled into their homes. Somewhere, nobles argued about politics, land, or inheritance because history has always provided an impressive supply of such discussions. Inside the monastery, however, peace prevailed. The bells would ring again before dawn. The prayers would begin again. The gardens, kitchens, workshops, and libraries would return to life. But for now, the monastery rested, wrapped in darkness, silence, and the comforting certainty that tomorrow would arrive in much the fairly predictable routine. The abbot often carried a different set of responsibilities. He still attended prayers, shared meals, and lived within the rhythm of monastic life. But he also had the challenging task of keeping the entire community functioning smoothly. A monastery was, in many ways, a small village with a very detailed rulebook. The abbot needed to oversee finances, manage land, settle disagreements, welcome important visitors, and ensure that the monastery's spiritual life remained healthy. It was a role that required patience in quantities that modern managers would probably find impressive. Not every problem involved grand theological questions. Sometimes a roof needed repairing. Sometimes supplies were running low. Sometimes two otherwise peaceful monks disagreed about a practical matter and needed guidance. The best abbots understood that leadership often consisted of many small decisions rather than a few dramatic ones. So while the bell continued to guide the community through its daily rhythm, the abbot quietly worked behind the scenes, helping ensure that prayers were said, gardens were tended, books were copied, and the monastery remained the calm, orderly their lives within a stable and predictable routine. The guest house occasionally introduced a little variety into the day. Travel in the Middle Ages was rarely comfortable. Roads could be muddy, weather could be uncooperative, and inns were not always available. For this reason, monasteries often welcomed travelers who needed a place to rest. The guest house stood as a bridge between the quiet monastic world and the busy lives of people passing through it. Pilgrims arrived carrying stories from distant regions. Merchants brought news from towns and markets. Messengers appeared with letters and official business. Sometimes a noble traveler sought shelter for the night, accompanied by servants who probably brought far more noise than the monks would have preferred. Hospitality was an important duty, so guests were treated with respect and provided with food and lodging when possible. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, most visitors continued on their journeys. The guest house emptied. The gate closed. The sounds of travel faded into the distance. And the monastery, never particularly interested in excitement to begin with, returned happily to its familiar rhythm of bells. Most days in a monastery passed with quiet predictability. Then, every so often, nature decided to provide a reminder that not everything followed a schedule. A storm rolling across the countryside could transform the atmosphere completely. Dark clouds gathered over the fields. Wind rattled shutters. Rain drummed against roofs and splashed across stone pathways. Inside the monastery, however, life continued as calmly as possible. The bells still rang. Prayers still took place. Meals were still served. Monastic routine had a remarkable ability to carry on through circumstances that might have encouraged everyone else to stay under a blanket. Of course, storms occasionally created practical problems. A leaking roof might demand attention. Strong winds could damage trees or fences. Someone would inevitably be assigned the less than glamorous task of inspecting the damage afterward. Yet there was also something comforting about being inside during a storm. Candles flickered in the church. Rain tapped softly against windows. Scribes continued their work. Readers turned pages. The weather raged beyond the walls, but within them, the monastery remained what it had always tried to be. A place of order, stability, and calm in an often was measured not only by bells and prayer services, but also by the changing seasons. Spring, Summer, autumn, and winter each brought their own duties, challenges, and familiar rhythms. Spring arrived with fresh energy. Gardens were planted, fields were prepared, and the monastery grounds slowly came back to life after the cold months. Birds returned, flowers appeared, and everyone knew there would soon be plenty of outdoor work. Summer was busy. Crops needed attention, repairs were completed, and long hours of daylight allowed more tasks to be accomplished. The days felt full but predictable. Then came autumn. Harvests were gathered, food was stored, and preparations for winter began. A successful harvest meant security. A poor one could create worries that lasted for months. Finally, winter settled over the monastery once again. The gardens rested, candles burned longer into the evening, and more work moved indoors. Year after year, these cycles repeated themselves. Kings rose and fell, wars came and went, but inside the monastery, the seasons remained among the most reliable companions. A did not simply grow food and hope for the best. It also needed to store supplies carefully for the months ahead. That responsibility often led directly to one of the most important places in the entire complex: the cellar. The cellar was cool, dark, and remarkably practical. Here, monks stored grain, vegetables, cheese, preserved fruits, and other essentials needed throughout the year. Every sack, barrel, and basket represented preparation for the future. A good harvest was valuable, but a well-organized storage room could be just as important. The cellarer, the monk responsible for managing these supplies, held a position of considerable trust. He needed to know what was available, what was running low, and what should be saved for later. It was not a glamorous role. Few people dream of becoming a master organizer of turnips and grain sacks. Yet the monastery depended on such work. Thanks to careful planning, the community could face winter, poor weather, or unexpected shortages with greater confidence. Behind every peaceful meal in the refectory stood a cellar filled with supplies and a monk who understood exactly where inside a monastery was an experienced monk. In many places, monasteries also served as centers of learning, welcoming young students who came to study reading, writing, music, and religious subjects. For a medieval child, this could be an unusual experience. While many people in the wider world never learned to read, monastery schools offered access to books, teachers, and education. Lessons often took place in quiet rooms where students copied texts, practiced handwriting, and memorized passages that seemed determined to stay exactly the same from one day to the next. Some students would eventually become monks themselves. Others would return to secular life carrying valuable skills and knowledge. Teaching required patience. Young minds are naturally curious, energetic, and occasionally distracted. This was just as true in the Middle Ages as it is today. One can easily imagine a teacher explaining a lesson while a student's attention drifted toward a bird outside the window or toward the distant smell of bread from the bakery. Even so, the monastery remained one of the great centers of learning in medieval society, helping preserve knowledge and pass it on to future generations. Many buildings within a monastery, few reflected its sense of community more clearly than the infirmary. This was the place where sick, elderly, or injured monks could rest when they were unable to keep up with the normal rhythm of daily life. The infirmary was not a modern hospital. Medical knowledge in the Middle Ages was limited, and many treatments relied on herbal remedies, rest, careful observation, and hope. Even so, the monks took the responsibility seriously. Beds were prepared, meals were adjusted, and medicines from the herb garden were brought when needed. A brother who had spent years working beside the community was not simply forgotten when illness arrived. Older monks often spent more time here as age gradually made daily duties more difficult. The bell still rang, the prayers still continued, but their pace naturally slowed. There was something deeply human about this quiet care. The monastery was built on routine, discipline, and work, yet it also recognized that people sometimes needed help. And so the infirmary remained a calm corner of the monastery, where patience, kindness, and companionship were offered just as faithfully human life that remain unchanged across the centuries. One of them is this: clothes eventually become dirty. No amount of prayer, study, or gardening could prevent it. As a result, monasteries devoted a surprising amount of effort to washing garments, bedding, and other fabrics used by the community. It was not the sort of task that appeared in grand chronicles, but it was absolutely necessary. Laundry day involved hauling water, scrubbing cloth, rinsing it carefully, and hanging it out to dry whenever the weather cooperated. The process required time, energy, and a willingness to repeat the same steps again and again. Naturally, weather often had opinions of its own. A sudden rain shower could turn an organized laundry effort into a mildly frustrating experience. Still, the work continued. Clean robes helped maintain health and comfort. Fresh bedding made long nights a little more pleasant. Even the most devoted monk probably appreciated climbing into a bed that smelled less like hard work and more like clean linen. It was another reminder that monastery life depended not only on grand spiritual ideals but also on countless ordinary tasks performed with patience. After a long medieval winter, few places became busier than the monastery's kitchen garden. The cold months had passed, food stores had been carefully managed, and now it was time to begin growing the next season's supply. Monks and lay workers headed outdoors with tools in hand. Soil was turned, seeds were planted, and garden beds were prepared with the same steady patience that seemed to define every corner of monastic life. The kitchen garden was not designed to be decorative. Every plant had a purpose. Cabbages, onions, beans, peas, and various herbs all contributed to the community's meals. A productive garden meant fewer worries when winter returned. There was also something quietly hopeful about spring work. After months spent indoors beside candles and manuscripts, the sight of fresh green shoots emerging from the soil must have felt encouraging. The tasks themselves were simple, but they connected the monks to the natural cycle of the year. The bells still rang. The prayers still continued. Yet around them, the world was waking up once more. Leaf by leaf, medieval monasteries often surprises modern visitors. Many communities brewed their own beer. This was not because the monks were secretly hosting lively parties behind the cloister walls. The reality was much more practical. In many places, water quality could be unreliable. Brewing created a safer drink, and beer often formed a regular part of daily life. It was usually weaker than many modern varieties and was considered an ordinary beverage rather than a special luxury. The brewing process required skill and attention. Grain had to be prepared, ingredients measured, and barrels carefully monitored. Like baking bread, it was one of those tasks that quietly supported the entire community. The monastery brewery became another example of how self-sufficient these communities tried to be. Food, drink, books, clothing, medicine, and education all existed within the same walls. Of course, even brewing beer followed the familiar monastic pattern. There were schedules to keep, supplies to manage, and duties to perform. Medieval monks had a remarkable ability to turn almost every activity into part of a routine. And so, while bells rang and prayers echoed through stone corridors, barrels quietly aged in cellars below. Preparing for future meals, daily monastic life was another important figure whose work rarely attracted attention: the treasurer. While monks are often remembered for prayer, books, and gardens, someone also had to keep track of the monastery's resources. This responsibility involved far more than counting coins. The treasurer monitored supplies, recorded expenses, managed donations, and helped ensure that the community had what it needed to function. Candles, parchment, food stores, tools, and building materials all required careful oversight. In many monasteries, important items were stored in locked rooms or chests. Keys carried real significance. A trusted monk might spend years proving his reliability before being given responsibility over valuable supplies. The work demanded organization and attention to detail. A missing sack of grain or a shortage of candles might not sound dramatic, but small shortages could become larger problems if ignored. So while scribes filled manuscripts with beautiful handwriting and gardeners tended vegetables beneath the summer sun, the treasurer quietly kept records and balanced resources. It was another example of a simple truth about monastery life. Even the most peaceful spiritual community depended on practical people doing practical work. Over the monastery once more, the familiar cycle began its gentle journey toward rest. The workshops grew quiet. The gardens faded into shadow. The bakery's ovens cooled, and the last tasks of the day were carefully completed. For the monks, there was something reassuring about this rhythm. The same bells that had awakened them before dawn now guided them toward sleep. The same stone corridors that echoed with footsteps in the morning stood silent beneath the glow of candles. Nothing rushed. Nothing demanded immediate attention. The day unfolded exactly as it was meant to. One monk might spend a final moment reading by candlelight. Another might quietly reflect on the day's work. A third, after hours of gardening, copying manuscripts, or carrying water, was probably looking forward to his bed more than any philosophical discussion. Soon the final prayers would be spoken. The grand silence would return. And beyond the monastery walls, the medieval world would continue its endless movement of kings, merchants, farmers, travelers, and shifting fortunes. Inside, however, peace remained. Tomorrow, before the sun even considered rising, the bell would ring again. The monks would gather once more. And another calm, ordinary, remarkably busy day would begin, just as it had for generations, and just as it would for generations yet to come.